So let me just start quickly introducing the call. So today we have two policy experts from the Mozilla Corporation and the Mozilla Foundation side. So we have Claire here. Let me just start the presentation here. Can you see the slide full screen? Great. So today we have Claire and Udbhav here. We will talk the EU Digital Service Act and the eIDAS. I was told that's the way to pronounce it. And they talk about what they are and why you should care. So just introduce myself briefly. I am Francesca. I am a community manager in the community programs team. Then we have Udbhav Tiwari, which is a senior staff government relations specialist at the Mozilla Corporation, and Claire Pershan, which is advocacy lead for the EU at the Mozilla Foundation. Before I pass the words to them, I will just talk very briefly about the agenda. I will just give you a quick welcome to the Mozilla community, and then we will talk about the EU Digital Service Act and the eIDAS, and then there will be space for the Q&A. Please, you can put your question in the chat, in the Matrix room, or we also shared a moderator tool where you can share. Today, I will just skip quickly the presentation about the Mozilla communities. Apologies, since we don't have time. I will just let you know if you want any news. We have a new Fox Fooding campaign coming where you can help us test a new feature, and you can see it in the community portal, community.mozilla.org/campaigns. And now I will very quickly finish. Stop sharing my screen and give the word to Claire.
Great, and I'll start sharing my screen. And my presentation, I think, will be fairly quick. So I'm going to, well, first of all, I can introduce myself also, just following that. So I'm at the Mozilla Foundation. I do EU advocacy, and very much focused on one particular item, which is the Digital Services Act, which I'm going to talk to you about today. But just also to say that the Mozilla Foundation, there's a number of things that some of you probably know about, maybe some of you don't know all of them. So we do research related to kind of social media and big tech accountability and AI transparency. We produce the annual Internet Health Report. We have a network of fellows and grantees and projects that we support, and generally kind of work with the community, and I'm sure with many of you on this call. But so specifically, we're looking at the Digital Services Act and following its implementation phase now, because it really has a lot of potential to uplift the Mozilla mission for an open, healthy internet. And what I'm going to talk about now is kind of why did the European Commission decide to draft the Digital Services Act? What are the kind of the main components of this new regulatory regime? And what are the next steps? Because we're very much, this is very much a moving target, and we're really in the middle of this implementation phase. So why create a DSA? So the DSA is designed to update and complement the e-commerce directive, which is from around 2000. So it's 20 years later, and the internet, and in particular, the web, right, has changed a massive amount since this time. And we've seen it really become dominated by a handful of companies and services. And so with respect to that, the DSA is providing obligations, particularly on the largest services, to reflect their reach and their kind of systemic role that they now have in the web. In relation to that, the Digital Services Act was drafted along with sort of a twin regulation, the Digital Markets Act, and they're kind of this package that complement each other. So the Digital Markets Act really regulates kind of competition law related aspects. So the relationship between different services, while the DSA really regulates the relationship between services and then the end users. So in a sense, the Digital Markets Act can be seen as dealing with kind of macro level fairness, and the DSA can be seen as dealing with kind of micro fairness for individuals. And so the DSA also is very much trying to create just a harmonized ecosystem. It's also the European Union trying to act as a bloc, while different member states might be producing their own rules to create sort of a harmonized standards that are easier for businesses as well as for individuals. So what does it do? Digital Services Act will apply to services that operate in the EU. So similarly to the GDPR, which you are probably familiar with, it applies to actors that are not just based in the EU, but that are applying services to the EU or that have users that are based in the EU. So it has a broader reach. And the DSA applies to services and not providers as such. So for instance, it applies to Instagram and not to Meta. The DSA essentially differentiates kind of 4 different types of services, and it takes an asymmetric approach, which means that it has the biggest obligations for the biggest or most systemic providers. And the most novel component really is the new rules for these largest platforms, but there are a number of different services that are in scope of various obligations. So what are these VLOPs? What are these biggest platforms? These are services that have a systemic role because they reach to some degree 10%, as much as 10% of the EU population, if not more. And so the way this is calculated is by active monthly users. And we now have a number of services that have self-declared as being above this threshold. And the idea, as I mentioned, is that these services have a systemic role in our information ecosystem, and therefore they should have appropriate obligations. But then taking a step back, so what are the obligations for all of the different services in scope? This is a chart that kind of breaks down the main obligations. There are key exemptions for small or micro enterprises. So these are going to be organizations with fewer than 50 employees and a small annual turnover lower than 10 million euros. Those small and micro enterprises would be exempt from certain obligations, like the obligations to work with trusted flaggers, for instance. But if otherwise, if an organization doesn't qualify as small or micro, they would face the obligations of normal online platforms, as well as the obligations beneath that. So for instance, if you look at the VLOPs, they have these obligations for risk management, annual audits, data sharing, as well as all of the obligations beneath that. And the DSA has teeth. It has fines that can amount to up to 6% of annual turnover. A closer look at the VLOP obligations. So the obligations here are things that a lot of civil society organizations, researchers were advocating for many years. These relate to, for instance, complete ad archives, increased transparency on advertising targeting, an annual third-party audit that's also to some degree based on risk assessments that platforms would conduct themselves, and mitigation measures the platforms have put in place. Things like data access for vetted researchers to help investigate and the systemic risks, as well as the measures that platforms might be using to kind of mitigate systemic risks. Also things like codes of conduct around specific topics like disinformation or accessibility or gender-based violence, and the obligation to have a recommender system that's not based on user profiling under the definition under the GDPR. So a lot of different features that are supposed to increase transparency, accountability, and also really to work with an ecosystem of other actors that can help also with compliance. So the next steps, where are we? Well, one thing is that VLOPs and VLOSs have had to self-declare. So they have had to share their average monthly users with the European Commission if they were likely to be above this threshold. And so we now have a number of services that are self-declared as VLOPs, and then some other services that the Commission is going to look into to see, to double check some of the numbers on this. Some of these are services that might not be surprising to see here. And going back then to our timeline, so we are, it's been over 2 years since the DSA proposal was released. It entered into force in November, but it hasn't yet entered into application. So it enters into application. Sorry, it's now entering into application through this designation phase, as well as through the implementation of other components, for instance, delegated acts, implementing acts, guidelines. There's a lot of kind of secondary elements that the Commission will release that will help add detail to the regulation as we have it. And then the DSA will apply to the largest services that have been designated in July around this time when they're fully designated. So right now it's the designation phase still. And then by February of 2024, the regulation will apply to the rest of the services in scope. And I think that I didn't mention this actually yet, but the regulatory structure is that the commission will actually become a regulator and will oversee the largest services, but that there will be also regulators in every member state, a digital services coordinator, who will be responsible for overseeing the compliance of all the services that are just below that 45 million threshold. And so those digital service coordinators are in the process of also being designated, and they must be, every member state must have their GSC by this time, by February 2024. I mentioned already this implementation phase. We received guidance already on the way of counting the average monthly users, so we have insight around this. And right now is the delegated act around auditing. The commission is consulting and drafting this delegated act. They'll also begin working on a delegated act related to researcher access to data. And then we can also expect guidelines around a number of these topics, like ad archives, child safety, deceptive online interfaces, etc. In addition to the commission as regulator, there will also be a branch of the Joint Research Center that's kind of an internal think tank within the commission that is going to help with sort of algorithmic auditing and assessments and the sort of technical components of enforcement, which is the European Center for Algorithmic Transparency. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Udbhav to talk about eIDAS. But if you have any questions about the GSA, about what's going on now, what are the next steps, how might you be involved, especially maybe if you're interested in research, especially if you're affiliated with a research institution, or if you do some kind of algorithmic auditing or have any interest in these components, please do get in touch.
So I see that the YouTube stream is a bit delayed, so I will just wait a couple of seconds and maybe ask one of my own questions. I saw that, for example, Wikipedia is there together with other for-profit organizations. Are there any differentiation between being a for-profit and non-profit organization in these regulations?
Yeah, so it's a good question. Wikipedia, excuse me, is the only very large online platform that is a nonprofit. And so if I am correct, they will be exempt from supervisory fees. So the other very large online platforms and search engines will actually have to pay to be overseen by the commission, because it's a massive amount of work to actually oversee their compliance. So there's actually a supervisory fee, and there was an implementing act looking at the way that this fee should be allocated. And if I believe that nonprofits will be exempt from this fee.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the stream is still delayed. Oh, okay, it just arrived at the thank you. So I see if there are any questions now. And if not, I think we can go ahead. Okay. Yeah, I will say let's just go ahead, and then in case we can continue at the end of the call. So I will leave the words to Udbhav.
Thank you so much. Over the course of the next approximately 15 minutes, I'll, at a very high level, be talking about the eIDAS regulation, or a law that the European Union is currently considering that pertains to digital identity, but impacts web security and encryption in some pretty worrying ways. The law has actually been in force since 2014. So this is like an amendment to the law where a new set of changes are being proposed to make it more modern and more suitable for like developments that are taking place in technology. And one of them in particular pertains to something called QAUCs, or Qualified Web Authentication Certificates, and my presentation will largely be about that. But before we really sort of get into eIDAS and what eIDAS is about, I'd like to talk a little bit about web security. So a lot of you would be familiar with this lock that's there on the top left-hand side, of your browser bars, which essentially means that the connection between your browser and the internet is encrypted. And what that encryption means is that nobody in between that connection can read the content of that you're sharing with that particular service provider. So for example, if this lock is present and you're logging into your email, that means people can't see your username, your password, and the emails that are going through that pipe. Similarly, if you're logging into a shopping website and you're giving in your credit card details, that means that your credit card details are protected. And the standard that is used in order to enable all of this is called TLS. And in particular, the implementation that leads to this lock being present is known as HTTPS, something that, again, many URLs you should be quite familiar with the fact that most of the websites on the internet now are encrypted in this way. And how it really works in practice is the fact that there are certain websites or certain providers or service providers who can issue certificates. And these certificate providers are known as CAs or certificate authorities. And I'm going to get into a little more detail about how they work. But the key thing to remember is that if you're a website and you want to get a certificate, you have to go to a certificate authority. Now, obviously, anyone can set up a certificate authority. And in order to make sure that a certificate authority meets certain security and privacy thresholds and standards, browsers run something called root store programs. And these root store programs are ways of browsers to vet certain organizations and allow them to ensure that they can actually be heard. I just found out that my sound is not very great. Francisco, would you like me to restart or maybe shift to a different mic?
Can you try to shift to a different mic?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Is it better now?
Not really. Sorry.
Yeah. Can you describe what's the problem with the sound? Because I'll just maybe rejoin the caller. I also have another device open next to me, so I can move to that as well. Is it squeaky or is there a background noise?
It sounds like, no, there's no background noise. It just sounds very like it's burbling a bit. I don't know what to describe.
So then I'll just be back in a second.
Okay, thank you. Apologies, everyone. This has been the call of the technical issues. I will cut this all bits off from the final YouTube presentation.
Hi, I shifted the mic, just checking if it's, yeah.
It works much better, thank you.
Great, thank you. And apologies for that interruption. And like I was saying, that these are root store programs that are operated by browsers. And what they lead to in practice is the fact that there are certain security standards that are followed by certificate authorities, which also have regulations, like internal standards that govern what they can and cannot do. And that this is something that governments around the world have really tried using as a way to conduct mass surveillance as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And finally, there is this law in Europe called the eIDAS regulation that's really looking at browsers and how they deal with certificate authorities, and is essentially going to create a ceiling for cybersecurity rather than set a foundation where every certificate authority that meets a certain set of standards set by EU member states will have to be recognized by browsers. And browsers can't set security standards that exceed those that are established by member states, and that's a fairly problematic idea. But before getting into all of that, really in detail, at a very high level, web security is one of the greatest internet success stories of the decade, right? As you can see from this graph, from between 2014 to 2021, the amount of web traffic that's been encrypted has risen from being between 25 to 30% in 2014 to over 80% in most parts of the world, and in many other parts of the world, like the United States and the European Union, that number is actually over 90% now over the course of 2020, which is a radical change. And the fact that this change has taken place in a period of about 7 years is really, I think, a testament to the efforts by a very wide community of actors to make sure that the web is more secure and better protected. And this 2014 uptake of the graph that you see really took place after Edward Snowden's revelations around mass surveillance. And so it demonstrates how security and privacy, which were considered optional really on many parts of the world, are now considered started being considered a mandatory norm across the internet. And the rise in this graph is really reflective of that. And in practice, the reason that rise has happened the way that it has is because certificate authorities, which I explained earlier, are entities that grant websites the certificates to be able to encrypt traffic, and it's used in HTTPS, are fundamentally endeavors that used to cost a lot of money. And Mozilla, along with many other organizations, actually helped set up a free nonprofit entity called Let's Encrypt that issued these certificates for free. So it went from being where you had to pay for using security and privacy on the internet to a scenario where you no longer have to pay for doing that, and anybody could purchase those certificates for free. And right now, Let's Encrypt is one of the largest certificate authorities in the world because of the fact that it issues certificates for free, and then many popular big websites use them as well. And browser root store programs defines rules for certificate authority, which is that they set the criteria that a certificate authority has to meet in order to be recognized by a browser, which means that if you're a general certificate authority not recognized by a browser, then you'll get an error saying that you're visiting a website that's been certified by an untrusted source and it may contain risk and are you sure that you really want to proceed? And it's the sort of warning that really deters users from carrying out those actions. And the thinking behind that is that the certificate authority that has issued those certificates is not recognized or trusted by the browser. And in order to determine the criteria of how a browser can test these website operators, there are extensive audit and policy criteria. And in fact, Mozilla runs the root store program, which I'm just going to click to be able to show you, that contains what are the thresholds that certificate authorities really need to meet in order to be included in our root store. And as you can see, there are both technical requirements, there are audit requirements, there are operation requirements, and it's a very detailed document that really creates the minimum baselines that certificate authorities have to meet. And there is also an organization called the CA Browser Forum, where the rest of the industry decides on what these should be together as well. While the actual details of the audit and policy criteria are not very important for this presentation, the key thing that needs to be kept in mind is that they evolve very rapidly and change very quickly. And it's very important for browsers to be able to have the independence to make a determination for what these audit and policy criteria are. Because without them, this lock doesn't really have a lot of value. And these policy and audit criteria are fundamental to ensuring that this means not just the fact that your connection is encrypted, but that it's connecting to the domain name that you actually want to connect as well. And if these rules aren't followed, then it would put usernames, passwords, and bank account information at risk. And due to the success of HTTPS, the one that I showed earlier, where it went from about 25 to 30% to over 80, even 90% now, root store programs around the world are really under threat. And that's because governments around the world have realized that encrypting over 90% of the web traffic means that it makes it much harder for them really to see what users are doing on the internet. We've had instances where firms such as Dark Matter have applied to enter Mozilla's root store program, and it turned out that it was the front of an intelligence agency for a country. Kazakhstan in the past has mandated man-in-the-middle attacks. And we have taken action collectively to ensure that they don't end up impacting browsers in a material manner by blocking that certificate, where in Kazakhstan, there was a period of time when if you went online, you were forced to install a certificate issued by the government on your computer before you could browse certain parts of the internet in some cities. And that meant that the connections would first go to the government and then to the service provider, which is almost like redirecting your internet pipe from just the service provider to a bunch of intermediaries in between. That includes the government and intelligence agencies. And it's a very easy way to conduct surveillance as well. And this has happened multiple times in Kazakhstan. And the proposed changes in the eIDAS regulation, while they're quite well-intentioned, will make this situation, and by this situation in particular, we mean how root store programs are under threat, much, much worse. And they'll do so because in late 2020, the European Commission began a public consultation on the eIDAS. And there is a new provision that was added in the eIDAS called Article 45.2 that mandates the inclusion of certificate authorities that are authorized by national governments into the root stores of web browsers. What this means is that rather than following the security standards of browsers, they now have to, as long as they follow the standards set by national member states, and national member states have very varying degrees to which they implement European legislation, but all of them, for the purposes of this law, will be treated equally. And if they are a part of that trusted service providers list maintained by member states, then they automatically have to be included in root stores. And there is no exception for security practices and no guaranteeing that there is parity with current best practices that are followed with the industry. So it's essentially a circumvention of the browser root store program and the standards that browsers like Mozilla really establish. And it's currently under consideration in the EU Parliament. At this stage, it's important to also note that Mozilla's root store program, we believe, is among the best in class because it's completely public. All decisions for the root store program are made publicly. All discussions in the root store program happen on a public mailing list that anyone can see. All applications are also, after removing privately identifiable information, are also public. So the entire discourse is a very open, transparent one that anyone can engage with and share their thoughts, and is not like an opaque process that no one can track or follow. And this process is fundamentally under threat, and it runs being made redundant in the European Union if this Article 45.2 were to come into law. Now, what are the problems with this approach, right? Number one is that it actually creates a direct risk to users globally. Just as a hypothetical example, something like there have been examples that many other people have made in the past where even within the EU, there are certain member states that say for matters such as sexual orientation or reproductive rights have followed different standards than what are considered the baseline in the EU. And these governments will have the power to be able to certify certificate authorities and can use the certificates that have been issued by these certificate authorities to intercept and deal with traffic. While this has not happened so far, the possibility of happening it so far technically right now is impossible, because if a government were to do so, Mozilla could make a decision of blocking that certificate, similar to what we've done with the UAE, with Kazakhstan, and a bunch of other countries. But if this law were to pass, we would not have that discretion anymore. And all we are really asking for is giving us that discretion to allow us to make those decisions. And there are many other outcomes of allowing these kind of attacks, which are known as man-in-the-middle attacks, that the governments will be able to conduct with the eIDAS. And they include, number one, introducing many points of failures, where each member state will maintain a different list, and therefore each one of these qualified CAs could be compromised not just by governments but also by malicious actors. The EU has already had an example of Tor security compromising a CA with the Digi-Not-R attack, and this actually increases those points of failures that can exist. Browsers will lack transparency into what standards CAs have to meet, because they just say we're included in the EU TSP list, so you have to include us. We don't have to meet your standards. And there is nothing in the law that requires them to meet baseline requirements of security as either. And all of these are pretty concerning for us. The second really important point is the harmful global precedent that this really establishes, because we will be unable to push back on proposals like we did in Mauritius and Kazakhstan when the EU has set the norm that these approaches are acceptable. While the stated intent of this law is quite different, it's to improve interoperability and make more secure digital ID available across Europe, the technical details of what the European Union wants to achieve when it comes to browser security here and what Mauritius are approaching are the same. The intent might be different, but enabling a technical means for a good thing to happen also lets it be used for bad things around the world. And that's something that I think is really important. And ultimately, currently, the law is going through a co-decision procedure. So it's being reviewed in the European Parliament, where legislative markup is continuing through first quarter of this year. It just passed one of the committees, and the plenary vote, which is when the whole parliament votes upon it, is expected next year. And there have been quite some positive developments with cybersecurity exemption being present in the vote in the lead committee, which is the ITRE committee in the parliament. However, in general, there have been some problems in the council because of member state dynamics where some countries want this power, but also some it's a very deep technical issue. So its profile hasn't been raised as much at the council. And we're working quite hard to make sure that that happens and everyone understands the cybersecurity risks that this move will create. And in parallel, we're also working at technical standards bodies like ETSI in order to actually shape that when the implementation of Quarks actually does take place, what that implementation would look like to make sure that it keeps cybersecurity best practices in mind as well. So that's essentially a little bit of an overview of the eIDAS, how web security and authentication works, and in the work that Mozilla is doing and the risks that it is fighting against on behalf of its users, as well as the internet at large. I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions that folks may have.
Oh, thank you very much, Udbhav. That was really interesting. So as I say, that YouTube is a bit delayed, but someone commented in our YouTube chat, and they say, essentially they say that the Russian government is also starting to rolling out government-based root certificates. I don't know if you can add something on that, if you want to add something on that. It's not exactly the question, but absolutely. Like thank you for sharing that. It's something that we've been tracking quite closely within Mozilla as well, and many other browsers are tracking that closely too. The reason that the Russian government is issuing its own root certificate authority, primarily the reason, at least it's been said so far, is to maintain critical infrastructure. When they were initially released, they were afraid that sanctions that were being imposed by the rest of the world would lead to critical websites within Russia not working. So, for example, banking websites within which people within Russia used to communicate with each other. And Russia claimed that they were setting it up as an alternative, as a fallback. And so far, from what we've seen, that root CA has not been made mandatory for users to install in Russia yet. It's still optional, and we currently don't have any evidence that it's actually being used for those harmful purposes yet. The minute that we get evidence that it's being used for interception, something that browsers can figure out because of telemetry information, then we certainly, I think, will take actions, and it's something that the industry, I think, will have to talk about as a whole. But in practice, so far, they're going down that similar road, but because it isn't mandatory and because there isn't a law that says you have to support the Russian root store certificate, in some ways, it's actually less risky than this eIDAS. Yeah, thank you. So I don't see another question here. Let me check. I actually would like to have I actually have a question. So you were saying that you were trying to raise the profile of this issue. Can you talk a little bit about if there are any public campaigns going on that people can support, and how people can, do something about this?
Absolutely. So we are running a campaign called the Security Ahead campaign. It's a campaign for which we have like a pretty big website that has a lot of the details. I'm just pasting it in chat here. It's something that we can also paste maybe as a comment on YouTube so that it's there for folks to be able to see. And in case it's helpful, I can also just present my screen for a bit again, just to show folks what the campaign website really looks like. But it's called securityriskahead.eu. And it's a campaign that essentially talks about the Quarks website, talks about why they're dangerous, how web security works, why we're fighting, explains technical details, and then essentially provides a lot of information, both about the geopolitics and the individual impact. And this option, which is the use your voice option, lets you tweet about it and generally raise the awareness and profile of this issue as well. So I just thought I'd share that here so that folks can see it, and it has all the things that we're coming up, and it has a press release, it has events that we've recently held, and records of other actions that people have carried out as well. So all the things that you can see that you can do about it to understand the issue and to engage are on this website, but please also feel free to reach out to us either via Francesca or directly as well, and we'll be, in case you have ideas and things you'd like to do, we'd be happy see how you can help as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I don't know, Claire, if you have any questions. I'm just waiting to see if we get any question from the community. I just want to say thank you to Bob that is watching from the Philippines, and I know it's midnight there. So thank you for staying up to watch the call. Yeah. Do you want to add anything while we wait to see if there are any more questions?
Nothing on my end, apart from the fact that like a lot of the work that Claire has spoken about with the Digital Services Act is also particularly interesting to Mozilla, not just from the perspective of how large online platforms are, but but also how Mozilla itself responds to regulation that really like tries to create a more responsible internet. And we're very much in the process of figuring that out. For example, our transparency report is out publicly, and we've put out our monthly active users on that just a couple of days ago. And there are actions that we're taking to see if the obligations that apply to Mozilla itself. We don't just become players who ask for responsibility and don't implement like responsibility ourselves, but to be equal participants in making sure that we embody principles that are present in the law.
So I just copy paste another comments that we had in the chat if you want to have a look at it. I don't see any other question, but I don't know if you want to take that.
Yeah, very happy to. And thank you for sharing that. This message is something that we have seen with regard to the cyberbank, and that warning has actually been there for some time. So far, like from what we know, it still hasn't become mandatory and it hasn't been used for purposes to harm users yet. But we're definitely keeping a close eye, and if things changes, I'm sure we'll speak about it in the community as well.
Great. So thank you very much for coming, and we're sorry for all the technical issues we had in this call. But yeah, I just want to, since a lot more people watch it afterwards than at the moment, since this is kind of an uncomfortable hour for a lot of people, I wanted to know if there are channels where people can reach out, maybe not to you personally, but to your teams to have more information or to ask further questions.
Just on our end, it's public-policy@mozilla.com. So we have an alias that like external folks can reach out to us as well. But otherwise, in general, we keep an eye on like social media and other places where community members can reach out to us as well. And if not, that you can also like individually find me or other team members on like social media and reach out to us. We tend to like listen and would be happy to respond.
Great, thank you. Oh,
yeah, and for me, you can reach out to my email, claire@mozillafoundation.org. And if it's anything that has to do with other parts of the foundation, I'd be happy to kind of dispatch that over to the relevant colleagues. And also, of course, we're on social media.
Someone is telling me that they had a question, but I don't see it anywhere. I'm sorry. Let's see if they are going to repost. Sorry, I cannot see this question. But people say, thank you for the presentation, nicely done. So thank you very much for coming and for presenting. We have 5 more minutes, so if this person can repost the question, I can pass it on. But at the moment, I really cannot see it in the chat. Yeah, I also don't see it. Okay, sorry, we cannot see your questions. If you want to post it in Matrix, there are all the links to the Matrix room. I will make sure that it goes to the right person, and so we can answer it. So at the moment, we don't have any more questions. So I would like to say thank you very much for coming. And if there are any more questions in Matrix or, in the chat, I will pass them on. And thank you very much for coming. And yeah, good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. See you next time. Bye. Thank you very much.